The ancient city of York, the medieval capital of the north, proudly displays its heritage. But underground, an even older city has been brought back to life. It's been hailed as the most exciting tourism project in the country. History not just preserved but recreated, 1,000 years back in time. For 5 years, Coppergate in York was the centre of international attention in a bid to rescue Jorvik, the capital of Viking England. 500,000 visitors paid to watch some of the most valuable Viking remains in Europe being salvaged from a huge muddy hole in the ground. While planners drew up redevelopment schemes, archaeologists worked flat out to retrieve as much of the past as possible before bulldozers could sweep it away forever. It was an absorbing race against time undertaken by the York Archaeological Trust, led by director Peter Addiman. The 5-year marathon ended in 1981 to allow a new shopping centre to go ahead. How successful was Peter Addiman and his team?
Well, at Coppergate, we won that race against time, and we managed to rescue, before the development of this area here, something like, 15,000 small objects, 11,000 drawings recording all the material that had gone, and of course the remains of buildings, the remains of all sorts of things that could bring to life the Viking city.
Anthony Gaynor, the project director who turned the dream into reality.
We had these buildings on the site. They are, as you know, very fragile, very delicate and unique. And despite the fact that the City Council and the County Council would very much like to have made provision for them to be displayed to the public, financially this was not possible. So we were faced with a choice. Either, quite literally, the buildings go on a bonfire eventually, once we'd finished our research, or we set about and do it ourselves.
I think the people gave us the idea, really. We had 500,000 people coming in to look at the excavations, and their comment, their most common comment was, "Isn't this a pity that it's got to be destroyed?" And one day we had a supporter of the trust, Ian Skipper, who's been helping us in many ways. He came along, looked at these comments and said, "They're absolutely right, Peter. We ought to preserve this." And more or less put us on the spot. How did we do it? We hit on the idea of building an underground Viking centre on the place where the dig actually took place. So you could put the buildings that had been excavated after they had been conserved and treated back where they were 1,000 years ago, back where they've actually been standing for the last 1,000 years.
The Trust's most famous face, Magnus Magnusson.
Yes, about 1975 it was, when I had a letter from the chap who's organising the publicity side, who's asked if I could be chairman of the stewards, purely nominal, wouldn't have to do a thing, just use my name. Would that be all right? And I said, yes. Oh, that was 9 years ago. And it's been a growing enthusiasm and commitment ever since.
When the digging stopped and the reconstruction of Jorvik began, what role did he then have?
Well, to a large extent, I was just an admiring bystander. I was present when the idea started being kicked around. But my job had mainly been to try to raise funds for the dig itself. This was taking off into the stratosphere, this marvellously futuristic idea of not just digging something up, but making something of it so that people would learn as much as we had learned from being associated with it.
So on to the journey through Jorvik, carried automatically by one of the specially designed time cars that will transport all the centre's visitors through a slice of York history. A tour which starts appropriately with a journey back through time.
We have the time tunnel area, which is specifically designed not as a history lesson, but as an area in which people get some sort of idea of perspective in time.
Lively gratitude for the honour conferred on this ancient city by your presence.
Firstly, we want to explain to people, or give them an idea of how long ago 1,000 years is.
And most cordial affection.
It's, for example, 600 years before the Mary Rose sank. It's 14 grandmothers in terms of generations. It's a heck of a long time ago. They go back through 1,000 years until they arrive in the second area, which is the Viking city of Jorvik.
This is the first time when we've really seen the Viking as the man in the street, not the myth. The real person, the person who's got his family, who's got his work, who's got his skill, who's got his craft, who's got his trade to work, the merchant, the worker, the ordinary Viking. They weren't all brigands and rapists, although I'm sure some of them did, and a lot of people did find things that had fallen off the back of a longship, and they set fire to churches by throwing away their cigarette ends and that kind of thing. Well, once or twice that did happen, but the real Viking is here in York. And what this has done, I think, is helped to correct the idea of the Vikings as just cardboard characters who were simply brutality and nothing else. We're learning far more about the delicacy of their art and their skill, the way in which they invented ways of doing new things, the way in which they improved agriculture in England and Scotland. This is the real Viking. Now, what we're doing here, and what I think this museum does so brilliantly, is to bring them to life. Literally, we can hear them, we can smell them, we can see them, these marvellous sculpted figures, which shows the Vikings caught in the amber of time in the midst of activity.
Part of the whole display concept of the Viking Centre, of course, is that you are physically standing where the Vikings did. The place that we looked at very closely was Disney World in Florida. And what we have used in some ways is their presentation techniques and allied that to the academic input from the York Archaeological Trust to achieve this sort of blend of presentation with underlying academic correctness.
We've got very fine scholars working in the background to make quite sure we don't make the kind of vulgar mistakes which would cheapen the great achievement of the dig itself. To find the balance has been difficult. I think it's been done perfectly. I think that people don't have to be learned. They can be lay when they come here, but they'll go away a lot more learned without realizing that they have been soaking in education, soaking in their heritage right through their pores, through every one of their senses.
The design director who led the reconstruction, John Sunderland.
What's different about this place is that for the first time we've taken an academic, scientific subject and tried to make it entertaining. We have deliberately tried to break down the barriers, the glass between the observer, the visitors, and the objects that we're displaying.
Jorvik's inhabitants brought to life by Yorkshire sculptor Graham Ibbison.
This is the biggest project I've had since I've been a professional sculptor. Well, it's been a year's solid work, really. There's 26 figures, so one every 2 weeks. A lot of them are modelled on my family, the design team, and also people in the street, people in the local boozer. So they have a northern flavour anyway. Well, it's been hard work. I have enjoyed it. It's stretched my ability as a sculptor, mainly because I've had to make figures as if they've been stopped in a moment, like a snapshot. There's potential movement in all the figures, and that also helps to animate the whole museum.
The design team spared no effort in recreating the tiniest of details to make the Jorvik scene as realistic and authentic as possible. The tiniest and the most basic, even Viking cowpats were put back onto the dusty Coppergate thoroughfare. Altogether a remarkably vivid and colourful picture of an October afternoon in 984. Age-old techniques of construction had to be learnt and adapted to meet modern fire safety standards, traditional and increasingly rare skills being rediscovered along the way. The production manager was Phoebe MacLeod.
We've worked in very close conjunction with the environmental unit at the university, and they have given us a lot of direction as far as the trees and plants that we use. There is nothing here that wasn't growing in those days and that there isn't evidence for. We had some problems finding fishing nets, authentic fishing nets from Britain, so we managed to get some from the Gambia. We asked the British Caledonian people whether they would get their pilot to go down to the beach and try and get one for us from it, and he did actually, and it looks lovely, it really is beautiful. We've also got a lot of bowls, wooden bowls and wooden utensils made from somebody in Wakefield. We gave him the drawings from articles that were found on the site, and he's made them according to those instructions. The people at Musgård Museum in Denmark were very kind. They made up 3 separate-sized water butts, really, and sent them to us for nothing.
Jorvik is a total experience of history. Sights, sounds and even recreated smells.
Smells I heard about on a radio programme. I heard about this gentleman who creates them, and I rang him up and he said he would be very happy to come along and try and do something for us, and he has. From wood smoke, burning wood smoke, to a stewing meat smell in the house, a nasty sort of latrine-y smell down by the wharf.
Researcher, archaeologist Carolyn Lloyd. Her responsibilities included historical accuracy.
This is a wattle and daub house of a sort that was excavated on Coppergate. It's quite a bustling scene going on here. Probably tea time, as there's baking and all sorts of cooking going on. Herbs drying in the ceiling, game hanging. What? This lady here is an Anglo-Saxon lady, and she's actually speaking Anglo-Saxon. The other members of the family are speaking Old Norse. This, we hope, will reflect the intermarriage that would have taken place. They loved lots of exciting, flashy jewellery, silver, gold, bronze, that sort of thing, and the more the merrier.
Craftsmen were tracked down throughout the country. How did they react to the call for help?
Often you could pick up the phone, make an initial inquiry, and be a long silence at the end and sort of quite aghast. But once they got the information and realised what the project was all about, how innovative it was, there was a lot of enthusiasm and interest, and they learnt a lot themselves, which is nice.
This is the sort of ship that made up the great bulk of most of the Viking fleets. See, the trouble is everybody thinks of these impressive royal warships in Oslo, like the Gokstad ship. But in fact, the great bulk of the Viking armies, they were independent farmers, and a large farm could run a ship like this. The crew it would have would be about 7, and this ship would be the tramp steamer of the Viking Age. If you look at these wooden blocks here, they're not like a 19th century pulley block because there's no wheel in them. The Vikings didn't use that sort of thing. Now that means that to cut down the friction as the rope runs round there, you've got to use walrus hide. We couldn't get genuine walrus hide, so these have had to be twisted up out of ordinary cowhide and oiled. And this thing, the sail sticker, this big wooden belaying pin sticking in a hole in the ship's side, is the sort of safety quick-release mechanism. You have the tack of the sail made fast with a hitch round here, around the outside of the hull, and then when you want to tack, you get hold of this big wooden handle with both hands and lay back on it, and it pulls out, the tack goes flying up in the air, and the fellas aft start sheeting in again.
The sail was made by Alf Redman from Whitby, a specialist in historical sail making.
The problem we had was actually finding the materials. In the end, we plumped for this, it's a mixture of jute and flax. It was the nearest we could get to the looseness of the weave and the stretchy. It wanted to be something stretchy and baggy. And these bands are just to hold the shape, help hold the shape. Before we put the bands on, it was interesting to see that where each seam was, it was pulling like these fancy curtains. I think possibly this might look a little bit better, actually, in some ways, than what they did in them days.
In Galderiskin Feldi, Tundi Achan Unglum in Galderiskin Feldi. That's a Viking Age work song, and it's what we sing on the tape when we're unloading the herring. It's about a man called Ingjald who got his nickname because he always used to wear a shaggy sheepskin coat, and he went out fishing and he lost 18 fish hooks. There's children's games in the sort of Old Norse that was spoken here in the Viking Age. That's done by children from Slingsby School. We've got the great friend of Egil, the saga hero. We've got him buying silver from the silversmith. We've got the angry wife rebuking the besotted husband. We've got the seaman asking where he can get the best beer. The English that is spoken in the north of England today doesn't descend from literary southern Old English. It descends from a mixture of Old Norse and Old English. Words like they and there and them and sky, these are all Old Norse words.
The Jorvik Centre is built in two halves. Having travelled through the reconstructed city, the time cars then pass into the second area, a mirror image of the first, but representing the original dig from which the reconstruction was made possible. The archaeologist who directed that 5-year dig was Richard Hall.
Well, we're actually in the original dig. It was by digging out the hole that we created the basement that we've set the whole centre in. They're not precisely over the original building spots, but they're very, very close to them. Well, people come into this part of the centre having seen what we think the Viking Age town looked like 1,000 years ago. And by this time, they're probably saying to themselves, well, how do they know it looked like that? What's the evidence on which it's based? So what we've done here is to take them back up the same area that they've just looked at, reconstructed, between the same two tenements. And we've put back in mirror image the building remains that we dug up during the course of the excavation. So you enter down there from the riverside, and you see the area of backyards with the wells and the pits and the latrines that you saw being used next door. And on the other side, there's the very stumpy post remains of the warehouse. And people are beginning to say then, I imagine, well, they haven't found an awful lot there. They're being a bit ambitious next door. Well, we come up into here, and we actually take them into the wattle building that they went into next door. And just as there was a hearth in the middle of that, so there's a hearth in the middle of this that the people were sitting around with. A lady was baking the bread. And just as there was a bench where the chap was sitting quaffing his ale, so there are the posts that represent that bench to us archaeologically. And there are the walls themselves, the woven twig work, and the bigger posts outside. The rewards were immense because we got these timber buildings, the best preserved structures of that date ever found in the country. And we found, I think it was about 16,000 individually interesting objects and vast amounts of pottery and bone, all the things which sound very boring but looked at by experts can put back a complete story of lifestyle and daily life as it was 1,000 years ago.
Senior conservator Jim Spriggs.
What the visitor will actually see in this street are the actual timbers that we found on Coppergate, which has now been preserved, and they have been fitted back into their correct positions relative to each other.
But how were the ancient timbers preserved?
It's a very slow process we're using. The process is based on a water-soluble synthetic wax called polyethylene glycol, which gradually permeates the wood and replaces the water in the wood with the wax. And after an 18-month period, we hope that most of the water has come out of the wood and the wax has gone in. Viking craftsmen were very good woodworkers indeed. The timbers from these buildings show that they used very good quality timber cut down probably locally from forests growing around about York. They used very simple tools and they didn't do more work than was actually necessary. The construction of these buildings is extremely simple but entirely adequate for the type of building they were making.
But at the end of the day, the success of Jorvik will depend on something new in British museum tradition, the ability to make money out of history.
I think that the profits will be in the area of £400,000 to £500,000 per annum. We are estimating that at 500,000 people a year will actually go through the museum, and that is considerably less than the number of people who go through the Castle Museum at the moment, and of course through the Minster, and a third of those that go through the Railway Museum. So we feel that what we have to offer is very exciting, and probably we've undercooked the number of people who will want to come.